When we get to Easter, in one sense it seems as though we're at the end of the story. Here we are, we've been reading Matthew chapter 28, the Easter story. Well, that's the end, isn't it? And the answer from Matthew's point of view is, actually no, this is the beginning. This is where the story really starts, because everything up to now has been establishing the new great fact with a capital F in the middle of world history. Jesus, through his death and now his resurrection, has launched God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. And so Matthew 28 really has a sort of ... at the end, which says, this is where we come in. So from that point of view, though yes, we have got to the end, this is the time to go back and reread Matthew as Matthew's first readers would have read it. Because Matthew wasn't writing for people who didn't know the end of the story, he was writing for people who were already followers of Jesus and needed to be reinforced and reshaped in their belief and their practice, in their following of Jesus and in their mission. So from that point of view, we can go back and read the story again in a hurry, like those people on Easter morning saying, hey, maybe now we can understand it better. Maybe now we can see where we fit in even better than we could before. But to start with, one or two things about chapter 28. Chapter 28 has a sort of breathless feel to it, as do actually all or most or all of the resurrection accounts throughout the Gospels and the beginning of Acts. Because Easter was a surprise. People often imagine that Jesus' followers had heard him say, well, the Son of Man has to die and then after 3 days he'll be raised. And so they were sitting there on Good Friday and over Holy Saturday saying, well, this is all very unpleasant, but never mind, because in 3 days he'll be back. Don't you believe it? That wasn't how they were seeing it at all. Many Jews of this period believed in resurrection, but for them resurrection was something that would happen to all God's people at the very end, not to one person in the middle of history. That wasn't in the game plan at all. So when the one they'd followed, their Messiah, was executed, as far as they were concerned, they'd backed the wrong horse. That had happened before in Judaism, it would happen again. We know of many movements in the century or two either side of Jesus, where a prophetic figure or would-be king had come up and people had followed him, and then the authorities had picked him up and executed him. And if the followers had managed to escape with their lives, they were then faced with a choice. Either find yourself a new leader or give up the revolution, sneak off home and be glad you've still got skin on your back. Jesus' followers didn't do either of those things. Oh, they had great new leaders, Peter and particularly Jesus' own brother James, but nobody ever said that James was the Messiah. He was the brother of the Messiah. Why? Because Jesus had not stayed dead. The only way we can explain the rise of Christianity from a strictly historical point of view, why it began and why it took the shape it did, is if 3 days after he was executed, Jesus really was fully and bodily alive again. Actually, more fully, more really than before, because he had gone through death and out into a new sort of bodily existence, which was no longer able to suffer or die. That's at the very heart of it. And just in case we're still worried, because after all, here in Matthew 28, people were skeptical, some doubted, people spread stories saying, oh, the disciples stole the body. People still get in a tangle about that kind of thing today. But right at the start, there's a very interesting note. Who are the first people to discover that Jesus is alive? It's the women who went to the tomb. Now, whether we like it or not, in the first century, women were not regarded as reliable witnesses in a court of law. If somebody was making up this story 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later as a way of giving the Jesus story a happy ending, if you like, they would never, ever have invented this story, not only women, but these women, Mary Magdalene yet. Now, what would they be thinking of? The answer is they told it like this because this is actually how it happened. Shocking then, shocking now, but it's the basis of everything else. So then we are charged, as it were, to go back to the beginning of the story and read it all again in a new light, because Jesus says, go into all the world, make disciples, teach them everything I commanded you. So suddenly we go back and we reread those great passages, the Sermon on the Mount and so on, not so much now as Jesus' challenge to Israel, not so much now even as Jesus' challenge to us, but as the challenge which Jesus, through us, wants to offer to the world. What would it look like if the church were to say, we are now Sermon on the Mount people, not just keeping our own noses clean, doing what we've got to do, but people through whom the challenge and the message of the Sermon on the Mount would actually go out into the world. You see, Jesus was able to say to the people of Israel of his day, you are the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth, but watch out, the light's getting put under a bucket, the salt is losing its savour. Maybe it's time that we learned how to say to our fellow human beings, you are made in God's image. You are supposed to be reflecting God to the world and the praises of the world back to God. But what's happened? You're reflecting the world back to the world. And if the world is just something which has no life in itself, then all you're doing is ultimately reflecting corruption back to corruption. And you're forgetting about God altogether. It's time to wake up and discover who you're really called to be. And there are many other things like that we could follow through from the Sermon on the Mount. But then we get to chapter 10, where Jesus sends out his followers to be his mission to Israel. Maybe Jesus is now sending us out to be his mission to the world, traveling light, listening for Jesus' commands, figuring out how to be people of peace as we go about our mission of announcing the kingdom. And then in chapter 13, the parables, where Jesus is explaining what the kingdom is actually all about. We have to be ready to tell fresh stories which will explain what God is doing. And if people think Christianity is just a cosy, safe religious option, the way we ought to be behaving ought to make it clear that it isn't like that. This is revolutionary, and it's the sort of stuff which will force us to answer the question, what do you think you're doing here? By saying, well, once upon a time there was a farmer who did this, or once upon a time there was a man who had 2 sons, or whatever. We need to be prepared to explain in fresh ways what we're about. And then in chapter 18, the chapter which is all about forgiveness, when Peter says to Jesus, how often should I forgive my brother if he sins against me? And Jesus says, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. If our ears are attuned, we ought to hear the message of Leviticus 25, the message of Isaiah 61, the Jubilee message. We are to be forgiveness people, not just in our dealings one with another, though that's got to be there, and that's very tough, and that's quite a challenge. But we've got to be forgiveness of debts people for the whole world. That's a challenge which remains in our generation. And then when we read the last 3 great chapters of teaching, 23, 4 and 5, we need to figure out how we can be people who can announce God's judgment and mercy to a world that desperately needs those clear lines, that this is actually wrong, God hates it and it's out of line. And this is actually the way to go, that great message of feeding the hungry, of caring for the prisoner and the stranger and so on, that we get at the end of Matthew 25. And if we were to take this agenda on board, I think we would find that once again the church would incur hostility, just as Jesus, when he was announcing the kingdom, discovered pretty soon from his vocation onwards that this was going to mean that he would face hostility and ultimately death. So we may find that suddenly we're on the same page with our brothers and sisters around the world who face persecution and hostility for their witness to Jesus. I had an email just the other day from a friend in a country somewhere in the Middle East who said that his job had just been taken away because he is a follower of Jesus, and asking me to pray for him. I felt humbled by that. There's this chap there doing his stuff, saying his prayers and losing his livelihood. We don't at the moment face that challenge in our country. The day might come. But if the church is doing what it ought to do, then it will incur hostility. There will be battles to face, and we will have to be Matthean Easter people in how we face them. So we come through Matthew 25, 26, 27, and then we come back to that big picture. Here we are in Matthew 1 and 2, and then in Matthew 27 and 28. At the beginning, the kings of the world come to the feet of Jesus. That should be our prayer, that the rulers of the nations will come and discover that Jesus is the one that they want to bring their allegiance to, as the end of the book of Revelation says. But we will also discover on the way that there will be the Herods and the others who will say, no, we don't want this Jesus on board. Thank you very much. We don't like that message at all. But again and again, we come back to the message at the end. Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. I wonder if in our generation we dare to take that literally and say, what would it look like if Jesus' authority, not just in heaven, that's fairly easy for us to think of, but actually on earth, were to be put into practice? What would it look like if the church bore witness to that authority in the public square, in the political arena, in the media, in down the street, in the pub? What would that mean? And as we may get a little nervous about what that's going to be like if we start to put it into practice, we hear that promise coming again and again, like the great bell which rang at the beginning of the gospel and now rings at the end. Emmanuel, God with us. I am with you always, even to the close of the age.